So Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand came out and said that they're not going to take super PAC corporate money, in the future. And this is obviously just, positioning for 2020 so they can look progressive. But what he went through is, so he went on opensecrets.org, and on Open Secrets, they break down where candidates get their funding. So they break it down as small donors, which is under $300, large donors, which is between $300 and $2,500, which is the maximum for an individual donor, and then corporate PAC money, which is obviously super PACs are unlimited as far as how much you can contribute. And the thing that interested me, now I obviously support getting rid of super PACs. In fact, I support fully publicly funded elections. I'm gonna argue the other point here because so even Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand, right? These are the biggest neoliberals you could think of, right? Somebody like Cory Booker specifically. You would think Cory Booker, oh, he must receive hundreds of millions of dollars from Goldman Sachs and shit. And I was actually surprised by how little money he receives from corporate donors. Going to Cory Booker.
That is actually surprising because Cory Booker is considered the leader of the pro-business wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, so here are the actual numbers. So from 2013 to 2018, that's a 5-year period, 10% or 2.3 million came from small individual contributions. 72.84% came from large individual contributions, and that's 16.5 million. And then only 10.62% or 2.4 million came from super PACs. So really, he only got $2.4 million from super PACs. So even if we overturn Citizens United, that's only $2.4 million for the biggest neoliberal in the party. It doesn't change very much. You know what I mean? While super PACs are a problem, large individual contributions perhaps might be a bigger problem, or at least just as big of a problem, right? What these large individual contributions are for the most part. Oh, I'm going to hold a fundraiser, in some swank apartment in New York City and invite a bunch of people from Goldman Sachs and charge them $2,500, which is the maximum, and then raise $1 million in an evening, for a dinner party or some shit. So that's 72% of where his money comes from, 73% almost. So I would say that even getting rid of Citizens United doesn't actually change anything. The solution, we don't even actually have to get rid of Citizens United because not that much money comes from super PACs. Lower the maximum individual contributions. That's the real key.
The problem ultimately with getting rid of Citizens United is that the Supreme Court and various other courts that uphold that essentially the reason why Citizens United is valid is it's a free speech issue.
Sure. But that's what I'm saying. We don't have to get rid of Citizens United. It's not as big of a problem as people think.
It's not politically practical to get rid of Citizens United.
True.
I don't think you really can do it. The courts have already made their decision where they're going to stand for at least a time period.
So it doesn't even matter though, because super PACs, like I'm showing, they don't even donate that much. So what we do have to do is focus on the large individual contributions. So if we had somebody run and say, oh, we're going to lower the maximum contribution that an individual can donate from $2,500 to $500 or something like that, I think that would actually have a bigger effect on, how politicians vote.
When I was down at the Student Action Summit for Turning Point, there was actually a group of people who were talking about term limits. And they kind of broke down a good chunk of evidence. You can give people contracts, you can give people special favors in terms of allocating out tax money. And so what the person said is that essentially the best way to fight actual corruption of where overspending on projects is to literally just have term limits. It has been shown empirically that states that have term limits will have lower spending.
It's called pork.
They'll engage in less pork barreling. And his argument also is not just they engage in less pork barreling, but then they have lower spending rates, which means they can have lower taxes. So if you want lower spending and lower taxes also, you'd support term limits. Which in that case actually was wow, I'm convinced. I wasn't necessarily, I was kind of iffy on it. I wasn't one way or the other. So actually that really convinced me.
I mean, I have mixed opinions about term limits because, I hear what you're saying and I'm not going to dispute that data. But in practice, I think term limits could come with some unforeseen problems. For example, there are power brokers, who exist in the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? People who wield power and are able to really bring their party or maybe both parties together. And we don't really see that, right? As Americans, we don't think about that. But there are some really, really effective senators and representatives. Yeah, and just throughout history, like I just watched the movie LBJ, LBJ's presidency and stuff. And he was a guy who was able to do that, right? Because of his connections, because he was in Congress for so long. But yeah, because he was, the majority leader, I think, because he was the majority leader and he had so many connections there, he was able to get civil rights passed because of that. And, he was also able to get, a bunch of other key legislation passed during his term. And that's because he had so many connections and he was able to just influence and influence and influence. So if we have term limits, just hypothetically, you're not going to have that. Now, that may be a good thing in some areas because then you won't have as much corruption. It could also be a bad thing because you'll just have a bunch of newbies in there who don't really know what they're doing. It's like good intentions and new people who aren't familiar with politics doesn't always lead to good results, right? Jimmy Carter is a great example of that, right? This great guy, I have a huge amount of respect for Jimmy Carter. He thought he was going to come into Washington. He was new. He didn't have experience in D.C. Thought he was going to clean shit up. Didn't happen. He obviously wasn't the most successful president. Having some people in Congress who have been there for several decades and know how shit works, that has advantages.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with that argument. In this case, I'm willing to take some risk. Most people just serve to just be like a voting bloc. I don't actually support what I'm about to say, but effectively it works basically where we all just vote for a party list. We kind of just say like, okay, who do we want? And here's like a list of people and we just vote for the party. We don't really care about the local candidate. I wouldn't actually support a system like that because I think in the end it does matter. But effectively for a lot of decisions, just as basically part of this party, you're going to do whatever we tell you.
Right. In the past, the party apparatus wasn't as strong as far as enforcing very specific views. Like I said, I was just watching the movie LBJ, right? And the Democratic Party was completely split. You had Kennedy, John F. Kennedy on one side from Massachusetts, huge supporter of civil rights, super progressive. And then you had the Southern Democrats on the other side, right? Who, were fucking racists, who opposed civil rights, at every turn. So these two wings of the Democratic Party on this major issue were allowed to exist back then. So what has changed now is the party bosses of both the Republicans and Democrats are really enforcing strict platforms that weren't there in the past. Now, this has a huge effect. And I would say it's mostly negative, right? We could talk about this for a long time because, what's happened, in the past, there was a lot more overlap. So, Gallup has done these polls and, some other organizations have done these polls as far as looking at overlap, right? And in the past, there would be perhaps 25% of Democrats who are more conservative than the average Republican and 25% of Republicans who are more liberal than the average Democrat. So there was a lot of overlap on the issues. But now, the parties have become more extreme and we have lots of data to back this up.
There's various websites that aggregate position of politicians. I do believe they had various institutes with various things like scorecards where they kind of show where the politicians stack up. And it's usually when you look at those scorecards of kind of okay, where do the Democrats fall on this one issue and where the Republicans? It's usually pretty. I believe the NRA, it's pretty much all Republicans highly regard it, where most Democrats have basically pretty low rating. I think that was actually one of the digs at Bernie Sanders because he had something a D+ or something like that from the NRA.
Oh yeah. But anyway, I guess the other thing I wanted to say before we move on to this issue, I guess, is back to the other issue. Perhaps, maybe super PACs and money even from rich people, maybe those things don't matter at all. So maybe even, I'm just saying, this is a possibility. Maybe if we got rid of super PACs, large individual donations, we got rid of, let's say, all financing, right? All private financing. All campaigns are publicly financed now. I'm going to propose that even if we did this, we actually wouldn't see that much shift.